The lake darkened by degrees. Eleanor Sterling sat at the head of the table and gazed out the window, where the last light of the day was fading across the water. She didn't need to look into the room to know exactly what was happening. After 72 years, she had learned that the most important things in life rarely happen in front of you. They happen in the corners you choose not to look at. Tonight, she chose to look at the lake. The mahogany table was draped in white linen. Candles burned at both ends. On the small cake centered between the dishes, someone had written in white frosting, "Happy 15 years, Marcus." The little candles were still lit. No one had thought to blow them out from the start of dinner until now, and Marcus had no mind to remind anyone. He sat to his grandmother's left, his plate untouched before him, both hands laid flat beneath the table, in the manner of someone holding themselves back from doing something they would regret. Across the table, Victoria Sterling held her wine glass between two fingers in the particular way she had learned from somewhere, perhaps a magazine, perhaps a party she tried hard to memorize and replicate. The teal cocktail dress fit with deliberate precision. The gold jewelry was just enough to draw attention, not quite enough to be called excessive. It was the calculation of a woman who had spent years trying.
"Mother, we need to talk." Victoria set down her glass. Her voice was smooth as silk, the cheap kind that looks lustrous, but creases after the first wash. Eleanor didn't turn. "I'm listening." "About practical matters. About the future." Outside the window, a water bird landed on the lake, sending out a small ring of ripples before vanishing into the dark. Eleanor watched the circles spread until they were gone. She had looked at this lake long enough to know that the surface always returned to stillness, no matter what had touched it. Julian set down his knife and fork with a quiet clink. He reached into the briefcase, withdrew a thick sheaf of documents, and slid them across the table toward Eleanor. His gesture had the practiced ease of someone closing a routine business deal, confident, pragmatic, without a trace of hesitation. On the cover page, 2 words in bold print: "Power of attorney." Marcus looked at the documents. He said nothing, but beneath the table, his right hand closed into a fist. Victoria began to speak about Clearwater, about a wonderful care facility with a swimming pool and around-the-clock medical staff, about how this house was too large for one person, about property taxes and HOA fees and financial burden, and all the figures Julian had already arranged in his head like a rehearsed presentation. She spoke of protecting Mother and worrying about Mother and only wanting what's best for Mother, phrases repeated often enough to become as hollow as seashells on a beach, all the ocean long since drained out of them. Eleanor listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not change her expression. She simply sat straight and looked out at the lake and listened.
"And Marcus," Victoria pivoted to her son, her voice softening in the manner of someone preparing to say something they know will provoke a reaction. "You're grown now. Your father has a project in Lake Nona. You need real-world experience, not... You're telling me to drop out." Not a question. 3 words, flat as a test result returned with its verdict already printed. Victoria fixed her son with the warning look she had been using since Marcus was 5. "The adults are talking." "I'm 18, Mom." "Which is precisely why you lack the experience to..." "What about my full scholarship?" Julian intervened with the tone of a man accustomed to ending arguments he doesn't wish to prolong. "The reality is that this family needs everyone contributing. It's time for you to carry some responsibility." The soft jazz from the kitchen speaker went silent. No one had turned it off. It had simply run out of song. And in that moment, the stillness became so complete that Eleanor could hear the candles burning. Marcus looked down at his plate. Then he looked up, directly into his grandmother's eyes. Eleanor was already watching him. Eleanor set down her spoon. A small sound, but precise and clear, like the strike of a judge's gavel. She rose, unhurried, without theatrics, with the composure of someone who knows that time is on her side. She reached for her glass of water. She never drank wine at dinners like this one, not because she disliked it, but because she had never permitted anything to dull the edge of her thinking in moments that mattered. She looked out at the lake one last time that evening. Out there, a small boat was moving silently through the dark, its bow light flickering like a star crossing slowly over black water. "Do you know what I did for 30 years before I retired?" Victoria opened her mouth. "You worked in insurance?" "I assessed risk," Eleanor interrupted gently, not to seize the floor, but because the answer was wrong and needed correcting. "My job was to look at a contract, any contract, and find exactly what could go wrong, what was being concealed, what would blow apart 10, 15 years down the road." She turned and looked at Victoria. For the first time all evening, her eyes met her daughter's direct.
Julian looked at his wife, then at Eleanor, then back at his wife. He didn't understand, and it was precisely that incomprehension that was the most troubling thing of all. Marcus lowered his face toward his water glass, hiding something that was rising at the corner of his mouth. Eleanor sat back down, folded her hands in her lap exactly as before, and returned her gaze to the lake, as calm as a woman who had said nothing at all, as calm as a woman with nothing to fear. The power of attorney documents remained untouched on the table, between the cooling plates and the candles burning themselves slowly down. No one had reached for them. And the Orlando night beyond the window moved on, quiet and indifferent, like the surface of a lake after the last ripple has disappeared. There are things that only become clear when you look back at them. 15 years ago, on Marcus's first night in the lakeside house, the 3-year-old boy cried until he had no tears left. Not out loud. Marcus had never cried out loud, even as a very small child, as though he had understood from very early on that the world does not reward those who show their wounds. He only lay curled on the new bed that still smelled of unwashed linen, his shoulders rising and falling in small waves, his eyes pressed shut, as though if he closed them tightly enough, everything might disappear. Eleanor stood in the doorway of his room for a long moment. She did not go in right away. She looked at this small boy making himself as small as possible, trying to take up no one's space. And she understood that this was not the moment for soothing. Soothing was telling a child that everything would be all right, and she didn't know whether everything would be all right. She only knew that if she lied on the very first night, then all 15 years to follow would be built on the foundation of that lie. She did not soothe him. She lifted him up. Marcus didn't resist. He was too exhausted to resist. And she carried him out to the lanai. The September night in Orlando was warm and humid, the air carrying the smell of grass and lake water. But their light is still traveling toward us, still reaching our eyes right now, at this very moment. Marcus watched the sky. His shoulders were still trembling, but less. "The people who lived before us are the same," she continued. "They are gone. But the right decisions they made, the things they built, the things they protected, are still reaching us, right now, tonight." "My grandma?" Marcus asked, his voice rough from crying. "Your grandmother, too, and your grandfather." Eleanor looked up at the sky beside him. "And one day, your light will reach someone else, someone you've never met, someone who will live long after you. But what do do I have to do?" She didn't answer immediately. She let the question hang in the night air, long enough for it to become a real question, not a question that needed to be soothed away. "First," she finally said, "you have to learn how to see." And that was how the Lanai evenings began. Not every night. At first, only occasionally, when the sky was clear and Marcus wasn't sleepy and Eleanor felt there was something that needed to be said. Then gradually, in the way that habits form without anyone noticing, it became a ritual. After dinner, the two of them would clear the table, then go out to the lanai with 2 cups, green tea for her, warm milk for Marcus until he was old enough to graduate to tea, and they would sit until the breeze off the lake turned cool. Marcus grew up through those evenings, not in the way of height or age, but in the way of someone being given a language that most of the world doesn't know exists. The language of numbers. When Marcus was 6, Eleanor spread the financial pages across the lanai table for the first time. Not a children's paper, the actual Wall Street Journal, with its dense columns of figures and its small charts and its company names that a 6-year-old had never heard before. "I want you to look at this and tell me what you see." Marcus stared at the page.
Because when people are afraid of losing what they have, afraid of others seeing who they really are, they build stories around themselves, like walls, and then they live inside those walls until they forget which part is the wall and which part is true. The 6-year-old didn't understand all of it, but he remembered. He remembered everything. That was what Eleanor had recognized very early about her grandson. That quiet, precise memory of his, like a ledger that never miscounted a single figure. In the years that followed, the lessons on the lanai grew more complex alongside Marcus. When he was 8, Eleanor taught him to read a balance sheet. When he was 10, they sat together analyzing why a large real estate firm in Miami had collapsed, not because the market turned, but because people had spent money they didn't yet have as though it were money they already did. They were living in the future, Eleanor explained, and forgot that if the future hasn't arrived yet, nobody owes it to them. When he was 12, Marcus asked her a question she hadn't anticipated. "Grandma, is my mom living in the future?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Out on the lake, a white heron stood motionless on a rock near the shore, its neck stretched long over the water. "Why do you ask?" "Because every time she comes to visit, she talks about things she's about to buy, about to do, about to go somewhere. But I've never actually seen her do any of it." Eleanor didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she said, "Observation is the most important skill you can develop. Observation without judgment." While Marcus was growing up through the lanai lessons, Eleanor was quietly doing something else. She was building his future out of bricks no one could see. From the first year Marcus came to live with her, Eleanor began moving small portions from her investment portfolio, amounts small enough not to draw attention, regular enough to accumulate over time, into long-term certificates of deposit. Not in her name, not in Marcus's name, in the name of a trust structured through 3 separate legal layers, administered by an attorney in Jacksonville, a man with no connection to Orlando and no knowledge of the Sterling family. She told no one. Not because she suspected everyone, but because she had worked long enough in risk assessment to know that the things best protected are the things your adversaries don't know exist. Every year, on Marcus's birthday, she added to the trust. Every year the amount was a little larger because she was still managing a portfolio none of her family knew about, because she had never truly retired in the way that mattered,
because the numbers in her head still ran every morning at 7 o'clock when she sat before her computer in the study with a cup of black coffee, no sugar. Victoria and Julian called it the old woman browsing the internet. They never asked what she was looking at. People rarely ask questions whose answers don't fit the script they've already written for themselves. That was their greatest mistake.
When Marcus was 15, the two of them sat on the lanai on a rare November evening when the breeze was cool enough to wear a light jacket. "Grandma, why don't you tell my mom about the trust?" Eleanor was not surprised by the question. He was old enough now to know what she was doing. She had taught him herself how to see it. "Because some things only work when they remain secret," she said. "A trump card that the other player knows about is no longer a trump card." "But she's your daughter." "She is." Eleanor looked out at the lake. Her voice wasn't hard, wasn't sad, only true. "And I love your mother, Marcus. I love her in the way you can only love someone you brought into the world, unconditionally and painfully, and with no way to switch it off." "Then why?" "Because loving someone doesn't mean trusting them with everything." She turned to look at him. "This is the hardest lesson I spent years learning, sweetheart. Love and trust are two different things. Love is a feeling. It's there even when people hurt each other. But trust is a judgment, and judgment must be based on evidence, not on hope." Marcus sat quietly for a moment, looking out at the dark surface of the lake. "What evidence do you have about my mom?" "I have 15 years of observation," Eleanor said simply. "And I taught you to observe." And for the first time in many years, he slept deeply, the sleep of someone who knows exactly where they stand in a story that others believe only they are writing. Down the hall, in the study at the end of the corridor, Eleanor was still awake. The computer screen glowed pale blue in the dark. On it, the trust fund tracking sheet from Marcus, a figure now large enough to become something real, no longer merely savings, but a foundation. She typed in a few more numbers, saved the file, closed the screen. Then she sat in the dark for a moment, looking toward the window where the lake outside was holding the moonlight on its surface. She thought about Victoria, the daughter she had given birth to, loved, hoped for, the daughter who had chosen her path a long time ago, in ways nothing Eleanor did could alter anymore. She did not cry. She had cried enough in her own private hours in earlier years. What remained now was only clarity, the thing people often mistake for coldness, but which was in truth the deepest form of love she still had left to give to everyone in this story, including her own daughter. She stood, locked the study door, and went to bed. 15 years were nearly complete. The last bricks had been set into place. All that remained was to wait for people to step onto them themselves.
And outside, the lake lay still in the night, holding within itself everything that had ever been thrown into it and presumed to have sunk, unaware that at the bottom it was all still there, resting quietly, waiting for the water to become clear enough to see through.
There are moments people never forget, not because they are momentous, but because they are the last moments before everything changes forever. Eleanor would always remember how that morning began. Ordinary to the point of being almost tasteless. 7 o'clock, black coffee, no sugar, the computer screen coming to life in the study. Outside the window, the lake lay flat as an unbroken mirror. A gray heron stood motionless on a rock near the shore. Its neck stretched long over the water with the patience of a creature that knows its prey will come, so long as it stands still enough and long enough. 3 days until Marcus's graduation.
She knew Victoria and Julian would arrive earlier than expected. Not for the ceremony, but because manipulation requires space, and space requires time. She had accounted for that. 2:17 in the morning. The first sound was footsteps, light, deliberate, in the manner of someone who has practiced moving through another person's house without leaving a trace. Eleanor knew the silences of this house so intimately that she could hear the difference between wind through a window gap and a person trying not to make noise. The two things were entirely distinct. Wind doesn't have to try. She opened her eyes in the dark. She didn't sit up, didn't turn on the light. She only lay still and listened. The footsteps stopped outside the study. The sound of a key testing the lock. Once, twice, then silence. The soft breath of someone weighing their options. Then the door easing open. She had left the study unlocked tonight, a rare carelessness that she would have reproached herself for if she had actually been careless. But she was not careless. She simply wanted to see what they would do when the door opened. Julian entered Eleanor's study with a small flashlight clenched between his teeth, both hands needed for searching, and he needed light but couldn't risk the overhead. He had thought of that. He had thought of many things, just not the thing he most needed to think of. The room was tidy, ordered in the manner of someone with nothing to hide, or someone who had hidden everything that mattered somewhere else entirely. Bookshelves along one wall, the desk in the center, the desktop computer dark. And at the back, behind the landscape painting of the Intracoastal Waterway hanging on the wall, he knew it was there because he had been watching for weeks, waiting for moments when she left the room long enough for him to check, was the safe. The painting was not large. Oil on canvas, a dark wooden frame, the scene depicting water at dusk, with the silhouettes of palm trees reflected below. The brushwork was untrained, not the work of an artist, but of a man who loved his wife and wanted to give her something money could not buy. Eleanor's husband had painted it on their honeymoon, 51 years ago, in a small rented cottage overlooking the Intracoastal. He had been gone for 20 years. She had carried the painting through 4 moves, and each time she hung it, she chose the position so she could see it from her desk. Julian lifted the painting from the wall without hesitation. His hands were steady, his movements efficient. He set it to one side, not gently, not roughly, simply setting. He stood before the safe for a moment in the dark, the small flashlight casting light upward from beneath his face, throwing strange shadows along the lines of his features. Then he turned and looked at the painting lying at an angle in the corner of the room. He looked at it the way one looks at something that is in the way. Then he kicked the corner of the canvas. The sound of breaking glass. The protective pane across the front cracked, a shard falling to the hardwood floor with a sound that was clean and sharp in the absolute silence of a house at 2 a.m. At the end of the hall, in the dark bedroom, Eleanor closed her eyes. Not from drowsiness, not from fear. She closed them because there are things that, once you have seen them, you can no longer pretend you haven't. And she needed a moment, just one moment, to remain in the darkness before stepping into the light. Tears ran down, one cheek, then the other. She didn't wipe them. She let them fall into the pillow, because in the dark of her room, only she knew they existed, and she owed no one the performance of hiding them. She was not crying for the loss. The painting could be repaired. Broken glass could be replaced. A scratched canvas could be restored. She was crying because the sound of that breaking glass was the sound of something else breaking.
No more hope that needed protecting. Only the work that needed to be done. She closed her eyes and slept. The short, deep sleep of someone who has made every decision that needs making. The next morning, the house woke to its usual rhythms, as though nothing had happened in the night. Eleanor came down to the kitchen at 7, brewed coffee, sat at the table with the newspaper. Julian appeared at 8, hair combed, shirt pressed, pouring himself coffee with the composure of a man who had slept very well. He didn't meet her eyes, but that wasn't unusual. He rarely did. She did not mention the study. He did not mention the study. They sat at the kitchen table in the polite silence of two people with nothing to say to each other, and she drank her coffee and read the paper and let everything unfold precisely according to the schedule she had drawn up long before. The painting she had put away at 5 in the morning, before Julian woke, after she had gone into the study and looked at the shards of glass on the floor and the small scratch on the lower right corner.
He wore a white t-shirt and jeans, his hair still slightly disheveled from sleep, but his eyes were completely alert. The eyes of someone who had slept soundly, not because there was nothing to worry about, but because he had decided that worry would not help with what needed to be done. He glanced at his grandmother. She didn't look up from the newspaper, but her finger tapped once lightly on the tabletop, a familiar rhythm that only the two of them understood, a private language built over 15 years of living side by side. Normal. Stay normal. Marcus poured himself orange juice, sat down, opened his phone like any ordinary 18-year-old on an ordinary morning. Victoria waited until Julian got up and went to the bathroom. She set her phone face down, turned to Marcus with the smile of someone who had been rehearsing what they were about to say since the night before. "Marcus,
I won't cost you a single dollar."
"Sweetheart, that's not the issue."
"Then what is?"
The question was short and direct, as a straight line drawn between 2 points on a map. Victoria looked at her son. For the first time that morning, she truly looked, not the calculating glance of someone running numbers, but the look of someone who has suddenly become uncertain about what they are facing. "The family needs you," she said, and this time her voice carried something different, no longer persuasion, but something closer to a command. "Your grandmother can't stay here forever. This house needs managing. Your father and I need..." "You need me to drop out so I can work for free on Dad's project that's already in debt." Not a question, not an accusation either, simply a statement, as calm and precise as a line in a balance sheet. Victoria rose from her chair. Her cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from being seen through. Those are two very different things. "Is that how you talk to your mother?" "It's how I talk honestly." Marcus looked steadily into her eyes. "Grandma taught me that truth doesn't have a tone. It's just the truth." Julian walked back into the kitchen at precisely that moment. He read the atmosphere immediately. He wasn't intelligent in many ways, but he was skilled at reading a room, which is the survival skill of someone accustomed to finding gaps to slip through. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice light, but his eyes already sharpened. "Marcus is being disrespectful," Victoria said. "Marcus is being accurate," Marcus corrected, his voice still even. Julian pulled out a chair and sat across from Marcus. He paused long enough to make sure Marcus understood this was a warning. "Our family is going through a difficult period. We need to get through it together. That's how families work." "Families don't withdraw from a child's tuition account for 15 years, Marcus said, his voice still as calm as the lake at dawn, "and call it getting through things together." The kitchen went completely silent. Julian didn't move. Victoria picked up her coffee cup and set it down without drinking. In the corner of the room, Eleanor lowered the newspaper for the first time all morning and looked up. But she said nothing. She only looked at Marcus with the same look she had given him across the lanai table for so many years,
Not the look that says you did well, but the one that says you are ready. Marcus stood, set his unfinished glass of orange juice on the table, and said in a voice so composed it was almost courteous, "I have things to prepare for graduation, if you'll excuse me." He walked out of the kitchen without looking back. Victoria and Julian sat looking at each other in the silence of two people who have just felt something slip from their grasp without understanding why or when the slipping had begun. Eleanor picked up the newspaper, turned to the next page, and continued reading.
15 minutes later, soft footsteps on the stairs. Then the sound of Marcus's bedroom door opening gently. Eleanor glanced up, and he was standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at her with a question in his eyes that didn't need words. She gave one small nod, small and certain. He took out his phone, typed a short message, and sent it. She watched her own phone vibrate on the table. Marcus's message, 3 words. "It's time." She looked at the screen for a moment. Then she typed back, also 3 words. "I know." Then she set the phone down, lifted her coffee cup and took a sip. The coffee had gone cold some time ago, but she didn't notice, and looked out the window, where the lake was brightening slowly under the Orlando morning sun, blue and still and patient, as it had always been. 3 more days. 15 years of preparation, and now only 3 days remained. And the gray heron still stood on its rock at the edge of the lake, motionless, neck extended, eyes fixed on the clear surface of the water below, waiting with the patience of a creature that knows its prey never realizes it has been seen until it is already far too late. On the morning of graduation day, Eleanor woke at 5 o'clock. Not from sleeplessness. She had slept well. The full, deep sleep of someone who has set down a burden they carried for too long and now only has to walk forward without it. She woke because there were days when the body knows in advance that today matters, and it refuses to let you waste even a minute of it in the dark. She lay still for a moment, looking up at the ceiling. Outside the window, the Orlando sky was still.
That wasn't unusual. She thought of him at the important moments, not from grief, but because he was the only person in her life to whom she had never needed to explain anything. He understood her in the way people only understand each other after decades of sleeping side by side and eating at the same table and being silent together without feeling the need to fill the silence with words. She wondered what he would say about today. Then she knew the answer immediately. He would say nothing at all. He would simply pour her a cup of coffee, rest his hand on her shoulder for a moment, then sit down beside her and read the paper. Because that was how he said, "I'm here. I trust you. You're doing right." Eleanor smiled in the dark. Then she got up.
The auditorium of Lakewood Preparatory School sat in the northern part of the city, in the area Orlando residents called the Green Belt, where ancient oak trees spread their canopies over red brick streets, where wealthy families had been tied to this school across generations and considered their children's graduation here a ceremony no less significant than any other social event of the year. Cars filled the lot by 9 in the morning. Pastel summer dresses, lightweight summer suits, wide-brimmed hats against the Florida sun. People greeted each other by name, with light embraces and the European-style air kisses that none of them were truly accustomed to, but all performed with the confidence of people who had done it long enough to forget where they had learned it. This was Victoria Sterling's world, or more precisely, this was the world Victoria Sterling had spent 20 years trying to become a part of. She knew the name of every person who walked through the auditorium doors, knew who was selling property where, who had just finished a new villa in Windermere, who needed a broker for the Lake Nona area. She wore red,
the color of winners, the color of someone who wants to be seen, and stood at the entrance welcoming guests with...
Eleanor chose a seat in the third row, left side. Not close enough to draw attention from the start, not far enough to lose clarity of view. She set her small handbag on her lap, checked her phone once, then turned off the screen and put it away. She surveyed the auditorium with a professional eye, not looking at people, but at the space. The microphone on the stage, the large screen at the back, the organizer's table at stage left with a laptop connected to the display, the location of the emergency exits, the positions of the people who would need to see the right thing at the right moment. In the third row from the back, a middle-aged man in a gray suit sat down beside her. He gave a small nod. She nodded back. He was the notary, the man she had contacted 3 weeks earlier, who had come to her Jacksonville office twice to review the documents, whom she had paid enough for him to understand that his role today was not witnessing an ordinary transaction. He opened his briefcase, withdrew a sheaf of papers, and placed them on his lap. Nothing more was said. Neither was anything more needed.
The ceremony began at 10 o'clock precisely, with the school's traditional processional, an ambitious piece performed by the student orchestra with an enthusiasm that outpaced their technique, though no one minded because no one had come to listen to music. The graduating class entered in pairs, blue gowns and mortarboards, faces flushed from the heat or from emotion or from both. Marcus entered first, as valedictorian, leading the procession, as school tradition required. His gown was pressed straight, his cap sat level, his step was measured and sure. He did not look toward his parents. He looked toward the third row on the left, and when he found his grandmother's eyes, he gave a single nod, small enough that no one sitting near either of them noticed it, but sufficient for both of them to understand that everything was ready. Eleanor nodded back.
The headmaster delivered the opening address, the standard words about futures and potential and the responsibilities of a new generation, words he had spoken often enough to deliver while his eyes rested somewhere else entirely. Parents applauded in the right places. Students sat straight and slowly relaxed as the speech lengthened. Then came the valedictorian address. Marcus walked to the stage. The room applauded. Below, Victoria pressed her hand to her chest with the expression of a moved mother, an expression designed for the people seated around her to notice and associate with her, to make her a part of this moment, though she had no part in creating it. Marcus stood before the microphone. He looked down at the audience. A moment of silence, long enough for the room to give him its full attention, short enough not to breed restlessness. Then he spoke. "Before I begin, I'd like to change one small thing." The headmaster looked up from his program. Several parents stopped murmuring to each other. "What I have today, not the scholarship, not the diploma, not the position of standing on this stage, none of it was something I created alone. There is a person who has invested in me since I was 3 years old. Not with money, or not only with money, but with something worth..."
Victoria went rigid in her chair. Julian set down his program. In the third row on the left, Eleanor rose, unhurried, without theatrics, with the composure of a woman who knows every eye in the room has turned toward her and finds that this changes nothing about her whatsoever. She straightened her lapels, picked up her handbag, and moved to the aisle. People began to applaud, polite reflex at first, then louder as they watched the silver-haired woman walk toward the stage with the bearing of someone who has never needed a stage to carry authority. Marcus extended his hand to help her up the final step. She placed her hand over his, light as a touch, enough to say thank you, then stepped to the microphone.
She looked out across the auditorium. Hundreds of faces looked back, curious, attentive, a few who recognized her name from the years when she was still active in the industry. She moved her gaze across them, the way she had moved it across boardrooms for 30 years, not reading the crowd, but reading each person, each face, each small expression. Then her eyes stopped on Victoria. Her daughter was sitting straight, her mouth still holding its smile, but her eyes had stopped smiling some time ago. Julian sat beside her, his hand on his thigh, his fingers slightly clenched. Eleanor,
I spent 30 years working in risk assessment, she said, her voice calm and clear, needing no amplification, though the microphone was doing its work regardless. My job was to look at numbers and find the truth behind them, not the truth people wanted you to see, the truth they were trying to conceal. The room held the silence of people who are genuinely listening, not the silence of courtesy. Today, I'd like to share something with you about legacy. She paused, and about the difference between inheritance and appropriation. Below the stage, Julian shifted slightly in his seat. Eleanor turned to the technical table at the side. Would you put up the screen for me? The AV technician, a young man who knew nothing of what was about to happen, looked up, nodded, and took the USB drive that Marcus stepped down to hand him. He plugged it into the laptop. The large screen behind the stage came to life. A data table, a column of dates, a column of amounts, a column of transaction descriptions, and in the final column, the name of the receiving account. Not Marcus's name, not the school's name, not the name of any
Those 3 words, "This is mine," hung in the air of the auditorium like a verdict that has already been read into the record. Victoria sat back down, not because she wanted to, but because around her, hundreds of people were watching, and she had spent her entire life constructing an image before those very people. And even as that image was coming apart brick by brick in this very moment, her instinct was still not to let it fall any faster than it had to. Eleanor continued. Her voice was measured and clear, as someone presenting an annual report. No excess emotion, no unnecessary drama, only the truth, laid out in sequence, with evidence accompanying each point. She spoke about Victoria and Julian's overdue mortgage payments, specific figures, specific banks, specific dates. She spoke about how the property documents in her study had been moved and replaced. She had noticed the morning after, when papers had been rearranged in a sequence that differed from the one she had memorized down to the last detail. She spoke about the power of attorney scheme, not designed to protect her, but to liquidate her assets and settle their debts. She said all of this in the voice of someone reading the following day's weather forecast, so calm that the calmness itself became the most unsettling thing in the room. Then she paused. She looked down at the small sheet of paper in her hand, not because she needed to, but because this was the part she wanted to say with exact precision, without omitting a single word. "I wish to announce, in the presence of all of you gathered here," she said, as well as the notary present in this room, Mr. David Harrington, 3rd row from the back, that the trust fund established for Marcus Alexander Sterling on the 14th of September, 2009, has been formally activated pursuant to Clause 7 of its founding documents.
As for Victoria and Julian, the complete file was submitted to the Florida State Attorney's Office and the Real Estate Oversight Commission 2 weeks ago today. I have been informed that they will be in contact in due course.
The auditorium did not erupt into noise immediately, not the way scenes like this unfold in films, silence cracking suddenly into chaos. Instead, there was a strange suspension, lasting several seconds, the way people respond to something too large to react to at once,
needing time for the mind to finish processing before the body knows what it feels. Then the murmuring began, low from many directions, spreading outward like ripples across the surface of a lake. Victoria did not cry. She sat straight in her chair.
On the stage, Eleanor removed the microphone from its stand. The clean, decisive gesture of someone who has said what needed to be said and has no interest in adding anything further. Marcus stepped to her side. She looked at him, her 18-year-old grandson standing on a stage with a valedictorian's diploma in his hands and an entire life ahead of him. The boy she had spent 15 years preparing not for this moment on the stage, but for the moment after stepping off it, when all the noise fades and a person is left with nothing but who they truly are, facing the world as it truly is. He looked back at her. In his eyes was something she recognized immediately. Not victory, not vindication, but the thing she had been waiting for longer than anything else. Freedom. But before she stepped down, she turned and looked at Victoria one last time. Her daughter was still sitting there, amid the rows now buzzing with voices, in the red dress that now looked like a miscalculation, wearing the face of someone holding herself together before the very people she had spent 20 years trying to impress. Eleanor looked at her daughter, truly looked, through all the layers of makeup and jewelry and performance, looked at the woman underneath all of it, the woman she had brought into the world and raised and loved, and ultimately could not save from herself. She didn't speak loudly, only enough for Victoria to hear, if she chose to listen. I love you, Victoria. That is precisely why. Behind her, the Orlando auditorium began to breathe again. The murmuring spreading, chairs scraping, phones appearing. But Eleanor no longer heard any of it. She was walking with Marcus along the side corridor, out into the blinding Florida sun, and for the first time in many years, her footsteps felt so light that she almost didn't recognize them as her own. The sun had begun its tilt toward the west, gilding the intracoastal waterway in the kind of light that Orlando residents call the golden hour. So gentle, it seems almost too beautiful to be real. Eleanor sat straight-backed in the ivory-white golf cart, her hands resting in her lap with the ease of a person who has just completed a task that has been unfinished for 15 years. Marcus sat beside her, leaning lightly against the side rail, his eyes on the water. The eyes of someone who has grown up in the space of less than 3 hours. He said nothing. She said nothing. The silence between them was not heavy. It was the silence between 2 breaths. Necessary. And enough.
The cart glided along the narrow path, edged with purple bougainvillea running beside the waterway, moving gradually away from the house where the noise of the graduation ceremony still echoed. Back there, Victoria was standing among the whispers of Orlando's social circles. Julian was calling his lawyer in a voice that was not quite steady. And the two of them were here, on this small path, beneath this particular afternoon, beside this still and patient water. This is the real reward, Eleanor thought. Not the moment on the stage. This. Marcus broke the silence first. How long did you know? Eleanor didn't need to ask what he meant. About them withdrawing from your education fund? She looked straight ahead. Since you were 11. You got sick and needed an appendectomy. The hospital costs weren't large, but your mother said the education account was temporarily short. I checked the statements that same evening. Marcus swallowed. Why didn't you say anything?
because at the time, you need.
Today is its consequence. Marcus looked at her. For the first time all afternoon, he looked directly into her eyes. You don't have to say that. I say it because it's true. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but there was something softer in it now. Something she had permitted herself only in places with no witnesses in all the years of her life. And I want you to understand, I didn't do what I did today because I am a perfect person. I did it because you deserve a clean place to begin.
The water of the intracoastal shifted color with the afternoon, from pale gold to deep amber to silver violet. A white egret stood motionless on the far bank, perhaps 20 meters away, like a small figure someone had placed into the landscape to complete it. "There's something I want to tell you," Eleanor said. "Not a lesson, only something I wish someone had told me when I was 30. Marcus was quiet, waiting. Legacy is not what you leave behind. Legacy is what you decide to carry forward. She gestured toward the water. The assets in your trust fund, those are only tools. They give you the right to choose. But the person you become from here, that is what will last." He nodded slowly, not the polite nod of someone being agreeable, but the nod of someone putting something carefully away inside themselves, somewhere it will stay. "Do you know what I'm most proud of in you?" Eleanor continued, and this time there was a warmth in her voice that he had never heard quite so clearly before. "Not your valedictorian grades, not the journal you kept, but the fact that in 15 years of living inside a house full of deception, you never became deceptive yourself." Marcus lowered his head. His shoulders trembled once, only once, and then he raised his face, eyes red but composed. "Thank you," he said.
They sat a while longer in silence. The egret on the far bank finally lifted its wings, skimming low along the surface of the water before disappearing behind the tree line. Eleanor followed it with the gaze of someone who no longer needs to be in control of anything at all. When the shadows began to fall, Marcus started the golf cart. "Let's go home, Grandma. I'll cook dinner." Eleanor looked at him. Her 18-year-old grandson, the valedictorian, the legal owner of a house overlooking the lake, and the only person in the world she trusted completely, and she smiled. Not the smile of someone who has just won, but the smile of someone who has just set down the last thing they were carrying. "Do you even know how to cook?" "You taught me everything," Marcus said, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Except that." Eleanor's laughter rang lightly over the water, genuine and unguarded, so natural that any neighbor out for an evening walk along the canal, had they heard it, would never have guessed it belonged to a woman who had just lived through the heaviest day of her year.
Some legacies are built with money. Some are built with names. But the most enduring legacy, the kind no one can confiscate or manipulate, is built when an older person sits down beside a child and says, "You deserve a clean place to begin," and believes it enough to give 15 years of quiet patience to making it true.